Hi, and welcome to Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark with my co host Benjamin Perkins. How are you doing in the wake of the election, Ben?
I'm doing well. I mean, I'm here in Montreal, the city and the province that I guess saved Canada from the Conservatives. So the Habs lost, but the Libs won. So the city's kind of doing okay right now.
Balancing out, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps it's worth then talking about the people who did not do perhaps as well as they would have liked to have done uh, on election night, which is, of course, the Conservatives. Interestingly enough, the Conservative MP Jamil Jivani, who was re-elected, came out in his election speech with accusations leveled at Doug Ford that he had sabotaged the Conservative campaign. Alongside this, Premier Houston of Nova Scotia, a Conservative premier, has also come under fire for having effectively, yeah, I guess you could borrow the same word as Stefani used, sabotaged the Conservatives and their. I mean, it was a close race in some respects. In other respects, it was not a close race. So, is it just bitterness on the part of the Conservatives? Are they looking to point fingers, or is there something a little bit more substantial going on here? And I think to see that you have to look at actually, well, what's the motivation for someone like Doug Ford? Why even uh, make the comments that he made about Carney? Why did Premier Houston not meet Pierre Poilievre in the only large conservative rally that Pierre held in the province? Clearly, there is a rift going on in the Conservative Party, and it's a particularly important issue considering that they have to rebrand themselves or remake themselves, especially, I suppose, if they have the moral compunction they've claimed to have throughout the election. They're hardly going to sit around and let the next 4 years happen passively. Um, and on that note, I would probably say a good way of understanding it is that Doug Ford and to an extent the Nova Scotia premier are, I would argue, more like Trump than Pierre is. And when you're a provincial premier, you have a little bit more leeway when it comes to how conservative you can be in view of how, say, liberal the federal government is. Probably they like a liberal government in a federal office they can blame. And also from whom, though, they can get a very different kind of assurance than they would get from the conservatives. And this is possibly why there's lots of comments online kind of criticizing that Carney is too weak before Trump. And I find these comments interesting because, again, really before the election, there was discussions, popular enough discussions among the conservative base that, well, why shouldn't maybe Canada should become the 51st state and sort of end the woke mind virus or whatever they call it. And
Mhm.
now there's this frustration that Carney isn't strong enough. It's the same point said two very different ways, if you know what I mean. Or kind of like even if there's interest in the 51st state, there was ambivalence within the conservatives about how to pitch um, Canadian identity. And now all of a sudden they're worried about Canadian identity in a much more substantial way. Now that the Liberals are at the helm. Again, is it a critique of the Liberals? I think there's more to it than that. I think that what maybe conservatives at this point don't want to admit is that there are conservatives in the party more similar to Trump and some who are not. And what does that mean for the party? And the easiest way to make the distinction between someone like Pierre Poilievre and Trump is that Trump, for all of his interest in slashing and burning government, is also interested in huge projects and bringing back, again, an enormous amount of manufacturing, of American industrial power. Whereas Poilievre, who might be interested in something like this, sees this as a more homegrown phenomenon that we can pass off largely again to the private sector, something we've spoken about more than a few times. And that difference also is illustrative in the difference between, say, someone like Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre. Right now, since pandemic, Doug Ford is, I think, has been a very different leader. He has a number of conservative talking points, but when you're at the helm of a province, you go through a pandemic, and you're put in this extremely pragmatic position. And for the most part, you just want more funding, as much funding as you can get from the federal governments, come what may. But there's also a kind of vigorous interest in, okay, if we're going to get something like an industrial base back or reinforce our industrial base, it seems as if there are parts of the Conservative Party right now that don't think you can do that through the private sector. And that seems to be, for me, a little bit what's behind this rift right now.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think I mentioned it on our last episode. Is that the issue kind of with the conservative position is it's people running for government who seemingly kind of have very little faith in government, if that makes sense. I mean, cutting red tape, getting rid of the woke mind virus, as you mentioned. Cutting spending, removing any kind of bureaucracy, basically things that they think impede businesses, and then those businesses will do well for Canadians. They'll create jobs, they'll get money into the economy, these kinds of things. They basically see government, by and large, liberal government, as a roadblock to achieving these things. Um, but I think that to me, my reading of that is that it's taken, I guess, more of a pessimistic turn than sort of an optimistic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, businesses can win things. I think that there's a few things there, which is that, most Canadians are not business owners, and most Canadians' lives have been kind of at the whims of business owners, and Canadians sort of know, how business kind of operates. I mean, I don't know what the official numbers are, but it seems like one in four Canadians wants to, burn Galen Weston at the stake. I mean, we're really in this moment right now where private business has not provided us with what I needed. Right, there's a huge concentration of wealth. There's no reinvestment in infrastructure, in any kind of public good, um, and I think that rift, to be honest with you, just comes from kind of a sense of realism, both in terms of how we're actually going to get things done and what people want. I mean, if you're a conservative right now and you've seen that Pierre Poilievre's lost, and you've seen that the conservatives have lost in general, um, you know that you'll have to work with the liberals, and you know that the liberals basically think that they can wield the system to affect some real change. Right, they're not actually interested in lowering the quality of anything. They're interested in big projects, kind of like Trump is. Um, and I just don't think you're going to be able to talk about being someone who's in government, uh and sort of trying to get government out of the way of things, because we know that Mark Carney does not take that approach, and Mark Carney is in power now. And I think that Doug Ford is someone who, to be honest with you, I mean, running Ontario, running Toronto, doing these things during the pandemic, like operating these COVID projects, is being at the helm of something that's kind of that big and that's much closer to what Carney's doing. And Pierre Poilievre did not have to do that. And maybe it sounds kind of basic, but to be totally honest with you, I think that really does change someone. I think that requires you to be a different kind of leader. And I don't think either of us are people who'd call ourselves conservatives, but Doug Ford was largely successful. Is well liked by a number of people. Really seemed to come into his own basically a second time post pandemic with the trade war. Has said a lot of great things about Carney, and I think it's not. I mean, it's obviously not to sabotage the campaign. I I think, to be honest with you, he just knows that it's more realistic, that you have to talk about being someone that can do things, not someone who is going to remove things so that others can do things, remove roadblocks. Um, and I think that Mark Carney won on the strength of that message, and Pierre Poilievre did not win on the strength of the opposite message. And conservatives are going to have to work with liberals, and I think it's just a question of basically survivability at this point. You cannot pretend to be someone who's just going to let everyone, let things get out of the way to help others. You have to be the person that's going to help others, and in fact, you have to be the one to start initiatives, not remove inefficient initiatives. So for me, that's where it comes from. I think that it's easy to maybe see Ford as some buffoon or some kind of ridiculous guy, but I really don't think he is. I think he knows what he's doing. And I don't know what's going to happen to Pierre Poilievre, but he's not willing to work with the liberals. I think he's kind of screwed, to be honest with you.
Or in this case, if he's not willing to work with his own party and
Yeah.
with where his party is actually having success, of course, I mean, the Conservatives will believe that they did very, very well in getting the share of the vote that they did. But as you say, practically, and really where it concerns, you mentioned optimism. I think that's a great point. Sort of selling optimism, maybe of a kind of older kind, this sort of, yeah, bootstrapping optimism versus the Conservatives needing a different kind of optimism, a sort of made in Canada optimism. And Pierre sold, yeah, one version of that, and definitely Doug Ford has sold another. Um, there's a video that Jordan Peterson released, which garnered 700,000 has garnered 700,000 views in the last day. And it's worth mentioning in this context because it's sort of an assessment of Carney. And Peterson has this line, I read Values, I read his book, and all you have to read is the first three chapters and the last three chapters. And in an hour, you can understand Carney. And at one point, he describes it. He says, the next 4 years are going to be a liberal, I quote, a liberal, utopian, globalist, environmental, net zero catastrophe. And this is maybe in a discussion of the mutations of political conservatism. This is almost a third kind. And it lines up with certain things. I think it's sort of, yeah, it lines up a little bit more with Pierre, but it's not a practical political statement. It's not a I mean, this is from, of course, Jordan Peterson, but he he talks about Carney, and he tries to qualify his lack of originality, that the book is full of things that Carney didn't think of himself, mainly sort of the whole environmental net zero approach, sustainable financial economics, caretaker capitalism, I think is one phrase as well. And it struck me that the frustration of Peterson, is that he sees someone who calls himself really a free marketer, maybe not a neoliberal, maybe not a neoliberal in quite the standard sense, but definitely a liberal free marketer. And he even mentions this as such. He says he is into free marketer because he wants to have central planning. And I think the unfortunate thing, and this is something that conservatives will have to face, is that anyone who attempts to do any kind of planning at this point will get burned. And, you hinted at it. It's like, well, you know, any amount of government is too much government for the conservatives right now, except for Doug Ford, which is sort of the sort of paradox we're trying to qualify here. Does Doug Ford represent a conservative who believes in government? I think it's a little bit more complicated. Again, trying to estimate what Peterson is getting at, I think there's fear at how even a good neoliberal price mechanism like the carbon tax is not good enough. It's not just, it's not good enough politically, but it's not good enough economically. And is that a failure of price mechanisms, of, axioms of neoliberal economy? Or is it just Carney's failure? Well, you can see what's more approachable for a conservative like Peterson, and I think that reticence to face the collapse in not just the management of, say, Canada or the Canadian government, but the global economy, and like navigating any massive economic or financial system or transaction means confronting this free fall in the capacity to plan. The fact that this is portrayed as if it's, again, the markets are working perfectly, is perhaps the strongest contemporary economic axiom, which is that pure markets are possible. Um, Despite the fact that, um, in order for pure markets to be possible, you have to take away every variable that involves actual human decision making. Things like time, for instance, which are pretty important.
Hmm.
Markets in their present theoretical form are timeless. Anyone can buy anything, so all assets are available. Lots of these fantasies, in short, that have to be written into the models to make them make sense. When you take away the academic economics, though, and you just have the political philosophy that is advocated by someone like Pierre or someone like Jordan Peterson, what you see is a willingness to embrace free fall. And this maybe is where the kind of, I would almost call it, the toxic individualism comes from a repression on the one hand of the breakdown of planning. I mean, you can associate it with government. At this point, government is a metaphor for any kind of planning. You can call it central planning and say, well, it's just like the socialists. It
Hmm.
seems as if any kind of planning is impossible. And rather than confront that impossibility, rather than recognize that there's a fundamentally missing critique. It's not in Carney either. In that sense, Peterson is angry at someone he expects to show up and do the really important job, something that Peterson himself regularly calls out. And maybe a way of sort of formulating their respective positions is to say that Peterson allows you to be a leftist without a critique of capitalism. He allows you to feel angry and to embrace the free fall. In this sense, again, one can sharply distinguish him from someone like Doug Ford, even from someone like Trump. And not that one should go quite to the bank yet in terms in terms of those people's policies, because I think that there are failures, strong failures, even in the concept of planning that they have. It is generally crisis management of a kind. And to describe Carney, maybe, fairly, I think that he allows some capitalists, shall we say, some neoliberals, some present defenders of the economic system to to he fantasizes for the present system. His book Values is full of fantasies. In many respects, net zero and the whole technocracy of this kind of greenwashing economy is a fantasy for capitalism. In other words, a way for the present economic system to imagine its own survival, despite the fact that it's in this free fall.
Hmm. I I am still not totally sure of what the conservative position is regarding these things at this point. Um, I don't know if it's that there's some pure transactional version of the economy where everyone says what they want and it's supplied to them. And if something is no good, it's going to fail. And if it is good, it's going to succeed. That's what it seems like. And at this point, you know, we basically know that this just isn't true. I understand when people point out things like, actually everyone could afford a house if we didn't have, I don't know, so many migrants. But it's like, well, the migrants aren't the ones buying the house from out from under you for a ton of money, right? I mean, they might be helping drive up the apartment costs, the rental costs. That's totally happening. Um, but this idea that that's out there somewhere and that we've just been impeding it, that basically society can just work on a purely transactional basis, sort of in the moment. That as soon as you, I don't know, you as an individual are some sort of beacon that's pinging that you need an orange or something, that somewhere something is going to receive that signal and is going to supply you with an orange for the right price within the right time that's going to fulfill the need and do all these things. It's just a total joke at this point. And the idea that someone out there maybe needs to regulate, and represent, well, what are we all asking for and how can we supply it and what are the logistics behind that and what actually goes into making this thing work, that any kind of that planning or even analysis is somehow impeding that pure version of this transaction that would make society basically a total utopia, even though in that there's always going to be sort of a winner and a loser. And so I don't know how that actually helps everyone. I think that always someone is going to get screwed over. Basically, just no one wants to believe it's them. They believe that they're so shrewd that they're going to be able to anticipate or overcome or navigate or whatever. Um, I think it's something that just needs to be let go of. Um, and I think that, the sooner conservatives are able to let go of that, I mean, both the base and the party itself, the more successful they're going to be when they realize that they actually have to do some serious planning. I mean, I don't think that there's very many people that would be against, the implementation of the high speed rail, for example. You can pitch it any way you want. You can say it's for consumers, but it's also going to help. But you can convince anyone of anything. But I mean, that's a huge project that the government is going to have to undertake. That is going to take some serious direct intervention to say we actually have to make this happen. It's really, really important. Quebec City to Windsor, we have to make this happen. Whatever, we take the loss or it pays back. That's the kind of thing. I think it's going to take probably more projects like that where you can tell people, hey, the net result of this is that you are not going to have to pay whatever via rail X amount of money for a delayed train that has to wait for freight trains and do all these things. Um, but yeah, I think the sooner we understand that the market is never going to provide us with a high speed rail system from Windsor to Quebec City, and in fact, they're probably going to give us basically a worse version of Via Rail, if anything. The sooner we'll be able to start actually getting projects like that off the ground.
It's worth looking at something that maybe people like Mark Carney and people like Jordan Peterson are maybe both ignoring, and parts of the country where there is a serious logistical breakdown. And to highlight this, just this week, over 100 First Nations across Canada have brought a class action lawsuit against the Canadian government, seeking compensation to the tune of $5 billion, claiming that overcrowding in housing, mold, bug infestations are the result of the failure of the Canadian government's housing plan where it concerns First Nations peoples. In fact, one of the co-lawyers for the plaintiffs, for the class action plaintiffs, Michael Rosenberg, even went so far as to say that there is a deliberateness to the government's failure of a housing strategy. There was a big report by the Auditor General, Hogan, last year, which identified effectively issues to do with siloing off, basic government inefficiency. Um, uh, this, of course, is an issue that you might think the Conservatives would jump on, an example of government failure. Uh, uh, Going back to 1999, which is the time of the class action lawsuit. At the same time, you know, it's not unlike our high-speed rail in that it seems as if the logistical failure is not just a question of government unable to figure out what to do. This is such a fundamental lack of care responsibility by the relevant institutions. And in fact, we know that as far as the politics is concerned, the Conservatives stay away as far as possible from First Nations issues and are fearful exactly of the huge numbers that are often required to address what might be in this similar multi-decade long failures of the duty. Of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission lays out um, goals which are meant to be followed through by the government. Of course, reconciliation is at the heart of this, at the heart of this responsibility. What would define right, the proper legal responsibility of the Canadian government? Of course, the Canadian government is arguing it's not our responsibility because the First Nations own it all themselves. We provide the money, but when it comes down to, again, the logistics of it, and maybe this is a good example of where, I mean, are markets working here or not? It's hard to describe. It seems like an environment where there's sort of neither markets nor anything else. Again, another example of this free fall. There's just a logistical black hole. And on the one hand, you have mounting government inefficiency because government gets neutered, neutered by endless global reality to do with how do we basically supply, say, something like housing, which is compounded by the scale of this issue being much, much bigger than simply housing, right? This is a social and cultural issue at the heart of Canada. It's bigger than economics, much bigger. But at the same time, it's so much bigger than economics, you wonder whether economics can ever solve it. And you have to ask yourself, what would be the perfect conservative plan to fix this? Get the private, get Indigenous entrepreneurs or get the private sector to build proper housing. I mean, there are lots of Indigenous entrepreneurs. There's lots of funding for Indigenous entrepreneurs. There's a lot, huge, significant billions of dollars in the Liberal budget is going to be earmarked in order to assist capital projects in First Nations. But is it enough? This is what's so dysphoric a little bit about looking at just those kinds of proposals, is that they appear wildly and market-oriented, private sector-oriented, and yet they're not conservative policies. So we seem to be, on one side, there seems to be people who have admitted the system is completely broken, and that's actually the Conservatives. They don't even necessarily want to defend the system that they're supposed to be defending. People like Jordan Peterson, to me, are the extreme case of this. They engage with so much religious and psychological metaphor so as to avoid the question of planning. And at the same time, there's people like Carney to some extent who have maybe something of the right rhetoric, but yeah, what the plans are in substance, very difficult to say. Full of a technocracy that seems to again find issues like these kinds of class action lawsuits very difficult. On the other hand, you have the free flow of the system itself, which even if we found $5 billion, wouldn't be enough money. It's not like so many of the issues that we talk about in the podcast, it's not necessarily a monetary problem. Now, there's an emergency here. Is a sort of the housing crisis we're not talking about, in a sense. But unlike our nice gentrified housing crisis, which is a little bit more responsive to global markets and similar things, and where we could possibly put forward a coherent strategy, this kind of housing crisis is both something that needs immediate practical intervention on the one hand, and needed a solution that is bigger than the forms of freedom and empowerment that the system presently offers, whether it's Canada or the global economy as a whole to Indigenous peoples, and really any Canadian um, at the moment. Um, and so, yeah, these logistical black holes, which seem unsolvable by the present system, this is the collateral damage, which again, neither liberal overspending or conservative underspending it seems able to solve.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is what I was going to say as well about kind of Doug Ford is that, um, we look at things like the Canada Post strike, for example, right? And this is something that we talked about quite early on in the podcast about, part of why Canada Post was striking is that they have all these part time workers who don't get enough benefits, don't get great pay. The people who are full time at Canada Post, same thing, not great pay, the working conditions, all of these things. Um, unfortunately, it's basically just that we don't actually have enough money to pay them properly. We really just don't. And I mean, there's all these arguments, which is that Canada Post is actually supposed to lose money. It increases the value of the dollar when it's so cheap. It's supposed to be for the average Canadian. We have to subsidize it. All these things. Of course, at the end of the day, you do kind of have to have the money. Um, and then there was at the same time, massive strikes um, at Amazon in Quebec, which is our private parcel delivery service for the exact same things. Not enough money, bad conditions, part timers don't get any benefits, all of these things, right? And and on the one hand, we have a crown corporation that's losing money, and on the other hand, we have the most profitable business that's ever existed in human history. I mean, they're just totally raking in incredible amounts of money. Um, and there's a few things there, which is that number one, I mean, they basically just can't afford to spend this money. They really can't. It's not really a spending problem. It's that they just can't. I mean, in Amazon's case, yeah, Jeff Bezos is worth however many hundreds of billions of dollars at this point, but we know he's not actually worth that amount of money. If he ever tried to enumerate that amount of money, the world economy would collapse, right? He does not actually have $300 billion that could be evenly distributed to each one of Amazon's, 100,000 employees. That's not how it works. It's the share price is tied into his money. But you know what it seems to me is that if we have these two things that are both at totally different ends of the spectrum, right? The Crown Corporation, where we're totally fine taking a huge loss, is not working out, and the private corporation that cuts every corner and totally fucks people over, has no human rights, built into their program, is also not able to give us, good jobs, upward social mobility, all of these things. Then to me, it doesn't seem like we have a monetary issue. It seems to me like we have basically an ideas and an organization issue. And I would say primarily ideas. We basically just can't even think post market. We can't think beyond winners and losers. We can't think beyond debt and spending and all these things. And that's sort of my concern with this election where we move to a more American two-party system, right? I mean, in the past we've had big coalition governments, we've had many parties represented in our democracy. To me, that's where you start getting ideas like that, where the Greens and the NDPs, have to figure something out that works for their base, and then they have to sort of team up with the Liberals to figure something out, or the Conservatives and the Liberals have to reach across the aisle because it's a minority government, and we have to. I mean, that to me seems like at least a starting point to have good ideas is a wide range of voices that are represented. And it feels very Canadian, to be quite honest with you. I mean, America should also think of themselves this way. Unfortunately, they don't. They've decided that two parties is, I mean, it's the way it's basically always been. But Canada has had coalition governments, multi-party initiatives. I mean, we saw lots of success with the NDP and the Liberals in terms of, pharmacare and healthcare and dental and all these things. Um, And so my hope is that, I would assume honestly that both of the conservatives and the liberals will start to lose a bit of favorability. I mean, the conservatives totally screwed the pooch in the election. They basically can't exist with the same identity. Pierre is gone and Trudeau is gone. I mean, it's a totally different paradigm. Um, the liberals, we'll see how Carney performs. I think that people were, I mean, think there was a total certainty 4 months ago that the liberals were totally dead in the water. That flipped in 4 months. It could flip in 4 months again. Um, you know, my hope is that other parties start to spring up, other alternatives, coalitions, and it doesn't even have to be political parties. I mean, it can be, whatever you want to call them, citizen groups, NGOs, nonprofits, these kinds of things. Um, because I think that that's how we'll start to have really good ideas. Is people who work in factories, listen to this podcast, are unemployed, actually start to get together and talk about these things. What I think is going to be much worse is if we all, like I said in the last episode, kind of start drifting to the middle. You're either conservative or you're liberal, and you have to sort of fit into one of those two camps, which at this point seem very very opposed to one another. And all it's going to be is, here's an idea that we should do, no we shouldn't, here's an idea we should do, no we shouldn't, versus many many different streams, many many different people all sharing their ideas, all having these discussions. I think otherwise, we really just start to slide towards the bottom of what's easiest, or what's something not terribly innovative, not terribly interesting. Whereas if we have this plethora of people and these big ideas, this wide variety, then we'll be able to start finding those really good kernels and expanding on them. So that's my hope in the wake of the election.
And I share your hope very much. This has been the 22nd episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.